Hey everybody, welcome to Broken to Beautifully Blended. It's week 2 of 2020, and we are excited to follow up on what we started last week.
Yeah, last week was What is Marriage?
What is marriage? And so we talked a little bit about what it is. We talked about some verses and how the Bible tells us that we are to live and how we should view marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought we'd follow up with that and go a little bit deeper into the explanation of leave and cleave. You'll hear people say that a lot. And so we thought, I wonder if people really know what that means. We didn't.
We didn't. We do now. And it can still be a struggle.
So the word leave is pretty clear. I mean, we all know what it means to leave something. You go away. But the word cleave is a unique word. It is called an autoantonym, which means it has double meanings, and they're opposite double meanings. So cleave can mean to split, and it can also mean to stick together.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say leave and cleave, it really means to leave your old life behind, leave your family's house, and sort of move and go away. And it also means to split that parent-child relationship in the manner in which you've had to this point. When most people get married, especially at a young age, that's a difficult transition. And it means to join together or make into one that marriage unit, that marriage bond.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just a physical bond. It's everything about what it is that you do. You are committing to putting your spouse second in your life. If you're a follower of Jesus, then you understand that the first thing in your life is always God and what God has for you and the things that He has called you to be and the person He wants you to live out. The second most important thing in your life should be your spouse. And then the third most important thing would be kids, if you have kids. Mm-hmm. And then on and so on down the line. But your spouse should be the second most important relationship in your life. Not your kids, not your parents, not your extended family, your spouse.
Yeah. And as you're no longer a child in the house, you're no longer under the headship of your father, who is the head of your household growing up. You're now, as a man, becoming the head of the household. And as a woman, the wife, becoming the helper to the head of the household. So you're learning new ways of relating to not just each other, but to family and to the world in general.
And if you remember last week, we talked about the fact that when Adam was in the garden, God tried to find every sort of a suitable helper for him, and He couldn't find one. And so He put Adam into a deep sleep, took out a rib, and created woman. Because the way that God created woman was different enough that women complement the way that men think, and men complement the way that women think. That's not probably the most popular thing in today's day and age, but it is very true that we were made to think differently so that we can complement one another.
Absolutely. So,
following up, we thought we'd go back and look at a couple of verses that we had last week. And the first one was Genesis 2:24, which a little bit of backstory is that we just talked about, that God had put Adam into a deep sleep, taken out the rib, and created woman. And in 2:24, he says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. This gets reinforced in Matthew when Jesus was speaking. One of the Pharisees had begun to question Jesus about marriage, about divorce. And so in Matthew chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, Jesus said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. And now that verse is also important because there are a ton of people in your life that are going to, especially if you're in a blended family, say, well, you should have never gotten divorced in the first place. We're not going to get into all of that business yet, but just know that even Jesus reiterated the fact that when two come together in a marriage bond, you become one unit, not two people working towards the same goal. You become one unit, hopefully chasing after what God's called you to. Mm-hmm. And then, again in Ephesians, Paul, writing to the church in Ephesus, reinforced this yet again in chapter 5, verses 31 through 33. It says, as the scriptures say, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. This is a great mystery, but it is an illustration of the way that Christ loved the church, or that Christ and the church are one. So again, I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So if you focus in on the end of that there in verse 33, so again, I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and each wife must respect her husband. Now, this was not the easiest thing for us to do when we were first married. Whenever we first got married, we brought along a lot of the baggage from our previous marriages and from our lifestyle growing up. Whenever you are raised in a family unit, and your views on life, the world, marriage, God, everything are typically formed in that family unit. So you have a certain vision about what is good and what is right and what is correct. And when you get married, all of a sudden you're working with someone who didn't grow up in your house. So they have a different set of what is good and what is right and what is correct. So those two things can collide.
Yes. And whenever you don't make the actual choice to cleave, to cut off your former relationships and start the bond, you say, we're going to stick together. Those former relationships, being parents or siblings or family members that did grow up like you did and do have those same values that you have, but they're not a unit with you, will talk in your ear. They'll say, this is right. This is the way we've always done it. This is right. Mm-hmm. And that can cause a lot of problems.
That's right.
In the marriage.
Now, some of you are going to be like, well, I need to have the input from my dad, or I need to have input from my mom. And that's true. Mm-hmm. And I would not encourage you to cut off that relationship totally. What we're talking about here is the priority of your marriage over those relationships. You should seek advice from people who have been down the road that you're on. I can remember as a kid, my dad saying, I was a kid once and I had these same thoughts. And I thought, yeah, my dad is an idiot. But come to find out, here I am, 45 years old, and I use the same line with my kids because I've been down the road that they're on. So I have some insight that can help them understand what it is they're going through at the moment. But the funny thing is, that doesn't change. So at 45, I know that I can still get good advice from my mom and from my dad, but it's just that advice. Mm-hmm.
And we have the pleasure of being in that seat of our kids thinking, they don't know anything. They're idiots.
Yeah. So for us, whenever we first got married, one of the things that really drove a wedge in between us was the fact that we weren't cleaved from those former relationships. For April, she spent a lot of time talking with her dad throughout the late afternoon before I would get home from work. And so as she's, dealing with kids and, her dad and her would talk, it's because it was habit. That's what you did for 15 years?
Yeah.
And so,
well, and not just my dad, but my dad and my aunt, so I was trying to get a well-rounded view, man's view, woman's view. It just wasn't what we needed at the time.
Right. And so by the time I got home and sort of unwound from the day at work and was able to sit down and get kids put to bed, because when we got married, the kids were pretty young, got the kids to bed, and then we would try and talk. And April's like, yeah, I've already talked. I've got everything out that I needed to get out, and I got some feedback, so I'm good. And I'm like, I haven't heard any of this. And so it was a struggle. And it caused a lot of issues, especially with her aunt. Her aunt and I didn't get along very well at all.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, I spent a lot of time talking to my dad because that was the habit that I had. I constantly talked with him. We had a lot of conversations about life and about what was going on, and he would offer up his advice. And it was just sort of the thing that we did. And so whenever I had something that I was up against that was bothering me, or that, was an issue that I needed to work out, I would often go to my dad before I would talk with April. And in the same way, whenever it would finally come up, I'd be like, oh yeah, I've got this figured out. This is what we're doing. And she was like, we never talked about that.
Yeah. And then you run into hurt feelings from your family because they gave you advice and you didn't take it. Mm-hmm. And if you did take it, then they felt like they had an opinion that they could continue to give more advice.
Yeah. So, again, take the time to seek advice from those people that have been down the road that you're on. However, the first and foremost responsibility that you should have would be to speak with your spouse. You guys talk about it, figure out what some common ground is, and then say, okay, well, let's revisit this and seek some outside advice. I would encourage you to do it together. Don't just go off into the corner with your family or your parent and go, hey, we've been talking about this and this is what I think, because instantly your family is going to go, yeah, I agree with you. Mm-hmm. Every once in a while, you're going to get some that'll not agree with you, and it'll be a little bit more common ground. But 9 times out of 10, the majority of the time,
I feel like you should also be aware that the landmine that you'll run across too is that whenever you start to bring those people in and you haven't cleaved and you're having those conversations, your frustration may come out and you may be upset with your spouse in the moment, and you may say something that your family members will hold on to for years. They will hold a grudge. They will be upset with that person because they believe that they're mistreating you, whenever that's probably not necessarily the case. You were just frustrated. So you have a responsibility to protect your spouse in your family's eyes as well, because your family is biased to you, and they're not going to be as easily accepting of flaws from your spouse. So you need to make sure that you're building up your spouse whenever you're talking to your family.
So, this has been sort of a doom and gloom episode so far. Sort of like, hey, look, this is awful. We're not going to leave you with that. Mm-mm. So one of the things that we have found, once we finally got to the bottom of the barrel, both of our first marriages had fallen apart. There was many things that played into that, but, you come out of those and you're sort of like, yeah, I think I know what I did in this situation. I think I know what I did in that situation. And you think, okay, well, I can move forward. But the one thing that we didn't do was cleave together. And so we were headed down that same road towards divorce yet again. And once we got to that point where we were at the bottom of the barrel and things were looking like they were over, God intervened, and he helped show us what it means to come together. And I can honestly say that over this period of time, the last 5 years, 6 years since this has sort of gone on, we have had some of the best times just working things out. Not always easy. There's still plenty of blow-ups and still plenty of arguments and disagreements about some of the dumbest things. But April and I, have had many good talks, many good experiences working out what's good for our family and finding common ground in that cleave. And I'll say that our families, while it was difficult in the beginning, whenever we first said, you know what, it's going to be different. And we sort of cut off those lines of communication for a while. And it was a complete cutoff for a while because we had to reframe the neural patterns of our brain. We had to make changes. We had to you can't just sort of keep doing the same thing. So there was a period of time where it was really rough with our families. But both of our families, April's family and my family as well, certainly see things differently now than they did 6 years ago. And I think that any of them would say that our marriage is stronger and that they understand our spouse better.
Oh, yeah. And you and Aunt Carol were able to see common ground before she passed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And there are there's many good relationships that are had now that were not being cultivated prior to, because there was resentment. I mean, there are certain things about the way that we act that created resentment in the family. April's attitude and her mannerisms are significantly different than mine. And so it's a little bit difficult for my family to understand what's coming out of her. And I've been married to you for 11 years. And there are still days when I'm going, are you sure that's what you meant? Because you said one thing, but it came out a completely different way.
Yeah.
And so...
yeah, we have a lot of more friendly. Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's a lot of, hey, less sarcasm from me. But it's an interesting, families are an interesting dynamic, no matter what it is that you do. And so, throw in 5 kids between the ages of 3 and 9 or whatever they were at the time.
3 and 9.
And you're in for a heck of a ride. But all that to say, once we put God at the center of our relationship and we focused on what he was asking us to do, what he calls us to do, that we became one unit focused on his call, our lives are radically different. We wouldn't be sitting here doing this today if it wasn't for that focus and for that cleaving from old habits into new togetherness. And so we want to encourage you to leave and to cleave, to figure out what that looks like for you. If you're in a blended family, I promise you, it is 10 times harder than it would have been in a typical family. I don't even say typical, that's probably not the best word. A normal or biological or first marriage, or there's probably 100 other words to describe it.
Nuclear.
Yeah,
I've heard that said, and I'm like, that is not a good word for that.
Well,
nuclear explosion.
Well, nuclear family is that lives under the same. I think the definition of that, if I remember back to school, was the nuclear family is what lives underneath the same roof. So, anyway, sort of chased that rabbit for a while, but. We want to encourage you to know that there are people that are going through the same thing that you're going through. You're in that pressure cooker. You're trying to figure out how to have this relationship with your spouse. You're trying to figure out how to deal with kids that are yours and kids that are steps. And it can be an intense pressure cooker. But let me encourage you to cleave to your spouse above everything else. And, there's going to be 50 different people that are going to tell you that the kids must come first. And the kids are important. Don't get me wrong. But the most important thing in your life is to follow what God's called you to do. And if you're a Jesus follower and you are seeking out God's will for your life, then God comes first, your spouse comes second, and those children come third, and then everything else is down below. So take the time to seek God's will. Spend some time looking up verses on marriage, and I promise you it'll change the way that you see your spouse. Remember, it says, "So again I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband."
And in that command, he commands us to do the things that are not natural to us. For a man, it is not natural to love, it is natural to respect. For a woman, it is not natural to respect, it's natural to love. So you're commanded to do the things that are uncomfortable.
Outside that comfort zone. So that's it for this week. We hope that you guys will spend some time seeking out what it means to leave and to cleave and to depend on that spouse, because that is the most important relationship on the planet. And we'll see you again in a week with some more marriage encouragement from Broken to Beautifully Blended.